You are listening to This Election, where we are committed to the inner work that is needed to do politics differently. This is episode number 7. I'm your host, Katie Cochran, and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast series offers a new way of looking at politics, one that focuses on how we engage with others rather than on our partisan identities or policy preferences. It explores why politics is so triggering and offers spiritual practices that heal past wounds, ground us in our bodies, and connect us to that which transcends our differences. If you are committed to active citizenship but feel worn down by a political culture of fear and anger, this podcast is for you. If you have lost sleep over politics, or your temper, or a friend, this podcast is for you. Politics is hard, but it's something we can heal from, and it's something we can change. It won't be easy. It'll take practice. But my hope is that the conversations here open us up individually and collectively to a new way of engaging. This election, we will do politics differently. Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith is a board-certified internal medicine physician, speaker, and award-winning author. She is an international thought leader and media resource on the mind-body-spirit connection, featured in numerous media outlets including CNN, ABC, Prevention, MSNBC, CBS, Fox, Women's Day, Fast Company, Psychology Today, and TED.com's Ideas Worth Sharing. She's also the founding physician and CEO of Restorasis, a professional development agency dedicated to restoring well-being in the workplace. She is the author of numerous books, including her bestseller, Sacred Rest, Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, Restore Your Sanity, which includes insight on the 7 types of rest. Over 250,000 people have discovered their personal rest deficits using her free assessment at restquiz.com. I discovered her work on rest while running the shelter during the pandemic. I knew I was exhausted, but as much as I prioritized sleep, I could not seem to recover my energy. Her reconceptualization of rest helped me understand that rest was so much more than sleep. Her work gave me concrete steps to take to restore my body and my soul. Politics is something that exhausts a lot of us. And so today we will be talking with Dr. Dalton-Smith about why that is and how we can reclaim rest while being active, involved citizens. Dr. Saundra, thank you so much for joining me today.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So one of the goals of the podcast is to expand our definition of politics to include not just our partisanship or our policy preferences, but also the ways in which we engage with others on political topics. Can you tell me about an early political memory and what it taught you about how we engage?
You know, it's one of those things where when I try to think about my earliest thoughts about politics, it all comes back to like the past 2 or 3 elections. I feel like I'm quite a bit probably older than you, and the politics and the elections from many, many years ago weren't as volatile as the past, 2 or 3 elections. And so I feel like it's the more volatile ones that are standing out in my mind, where family against family and friend against friend, and people really just became very decisive in the conversation. Unfortunately, when I think of politics, that's what comes to mind now.
That is what comes to mind for me as well. And I think for a lot of people when they think about politics at this moment. But my hope is that this is something that we can change and we can move to a kind of a different way of engaging. There's 3 pillars of what we're trying to do. So one is redefining politics. The other is understanding how it's wounded us. And then the third is what spiritual practices can we engage in to move through that woundedness in order to stay active and involved and hopeful. And so today's show is focused on rest as this practice that can enable us to do that. But I want to start with what the difference between rest and sleep is, and also rest and inactivity, because I think a lot of people think rest and they're like, I'll take a nap, or I'll try and make sure I get my 8 hours of sleep. So can you talk about the difference there?
When you think about rest, for most of us, we automatically think of cessation or stopping. And rest is not simply about stopping activity, but it's about the restoration of energy. And so when you approach rest, and when you're looking at sleep, which is what many of us use that word kind of interchangeably, I'm going to go rest tonight, and they really mean they're going to go sleep tonight. We use it interchangeably, thinking and pretending as if sleep is the only type of rest, that it is the end-all, be-all of rest, and if we get enough of it, then we should not be tired. The problem with that is that sleep doesn't hit all of the different facets of energy depletion that we experience. That's why when I sat down with this with myself going through burnout, I was getting 8 hours of sleep and I was waking up exhausted every morning. And the more I started looking at that and researching it, that's what a lot of people are experiencing. There are types of rest, type of restoration that each of us need that can never be filled back up or repleted simply by closing our eyes at night and going to sleep. And so we have to realize that there are aspects of our energy depletion, rest deficits, as I refer to them, that can only be depleted when we take intentional steps in the direction of the type of deficit that we have, that we need to replete. And so really at the core of rest is restoration, restoring energy that's lost and bringing it back up to a healthy place.
Yeah. So can you tell us about the 7 different types of rest? So you identify 7 types. Can you walk us through each of them? And as you do, talk about what the deficit is, but then also a little bit of how politics might contribute to that deficit. And then for each also some ways we can begin to move towards restoration.
Yeah. So the 7, just to have them out there, are physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, social, sensory, and creative. Some of them don't have as much to do with politics necessarily, like physical. You're not heavy lifting physically necessarily or anything of that nature, but our bodies oftentimes will take on the manifestation of some of the other types of deficits that we experience. Physical basically is looking at how you use your body, things from how you engage with your computer or how you're looking at your devices. It includes things like tech neck and aches, back aches and shoulder aches and those kind of things. Mental rest is looking specifically at how clear your mind is. Are you able to focus and to concentrate? Or do you find yourself when you lay down at night battling with busy brain, or what some of us call monkey brain, where you're swinging from thought to thought to thought and you can't clear out your cerebral space just to get clarity and kind of peace in your mind to be able to focus more clearly. And definitely politics can affect that, because sometimes when you have those situations where you've experienced something or had an argument with someone, you might be replaying that in your mind, or you might be replaying what a candidate said or something you didn't agree with and ruminating over it over and over again and get caught up in a mental tangle, so to speak, so that you're not able to get into deeper levels of sleep or able to turn your mind off at nighttime. Spiritual rest deals with the sense of belonging and purpose and meaning in life that all of us desire to some degree and may not be experiencing it in the type of work that we're doing. Now, because politics now do tap into a lot of topics that can come against things that we agree on as it relates to humanity and life, that can then start stressing some of the spiritual rest that we're needing and have us questioning ourselves and our own life and our own priorities. Emotional rest is looking at our feelings and how open and free we feel to express them. This one's huge for a lot of people as it relates to political situations, because many of us carry a bit of emotional labor in this area, because you don't want to get into fights with people every time a candidate pops up on the news or you see something on your social media feed. You may hold back on speaking your truth or being authentic or transparent about what your beliefs are, and kind of keep those emotions tight to your chest because you don't really want to go there with people. But you're still processing the emotions, whether you are suppressing them or expressing them, you're still processing them. So you're still using energy. And I think it's important just to be aware of that, and that when you are suppressing emotions, that backpack gets heavy. And at some point in time, you need a place where you can just be real, raw, and authentic. For some people, that's the polls. That's where they're real, raw, and authentic. You get to put your vote down and you did your thing. And so we have to find ways that we're able to express ourselves and where we feel the release of what we've been holding on to. Social rest deals with looking at the people in our life and how they pull from our social energy. And so if you're in a situation where maybe you're the only one who believes a certain thing or who favors a certain candidate, you may find that you always feel like you're at odds with people. And so you're using a lot of social energy just in those exchanges with people who are not maybe in agreement with what you believe or how you feel. So we have to be aware of that. Who are the people in your life who can pour back into you positively? who are not negatively draining and feel like they're draining your energy. And be aware that social media can be a social drain as well, because we are engaging with the emotions of people who don't get the benefit of our facial expressions when they hurt us. And so it's a lot easier to say something very harsh with someone when you don't see the response. And so I think we have to be mindful to how we engage with things that put us in vicinity of other people's emotions without the benefit of their presence. And so being aware of that and then protecting ourselves as needed in those situations. And then the final two, sensory rest is just looking at the sensory inputs. And so everything from our devices, for most of us, we don't need to have our news app set to let us know every time one of the candidates says something. They're always saying something. We don't need our social media pushing us what the polls ratings are. They're jumping up and down all the time. It's beyond what is necessary for us to be knowledgeable about situations. So turn off some of the notifications, downgrade some of the sensory inputs, being aware that sensory overload syndrome is a real thing. Whether or not you are neurodivergent, all of us have some level of sensory overload syndrome we deal with because our world's very noisy in general. However, if you do have any of those neurodivergent tendencies, hyperactivity disorder, you consider yourself an HSP, a highly sensitive person, any of those things, you're going to be even more aware of the effect of all of the notifications and things being pushed at you. And then creative energy, I should say, starts with the energy of just problem solving and being creative, being innovative, thinking outside of the box. And for most of us, we aren't necessarily having to solve a problem in politics. We're not working within politics, so we're not necessarily having to solve those kind of problems. But you may be having to solve the problem of how do you keep peace in your home in the middle of the political season. So you may be having to be creative in that regard. You're having your Thanksgiving meal right after all of the polling has finished. How do we have Thanksgiving without World War III breaking out in our home? So you may be using creative energy there, trying to think through, let's find some safe conversations to talk about so we don't veer off into things that are going to take us down the wrong path.
Yeah, and I also think on the creative side, for the policies and the things that are happening in society that we care about, there is part of our brains that are sometimes like, how could we make it better? And so there's a little bit of creativity going into those questions. So can you talk a little bit about on the creativity side, how you replenish the creative rest?
Yeah, so creative rest is looking at what inspires you, what brings you back to that place of childlike awe and wonder. And so for a lot of people, it's natural things. And so some people say, oh, when I'm at the ocean or I look at the mountains or I stare at the stars, it's like I get inspired. And that's what really creative rest is about, is the restorative process of wonder and really just allowing yourself to appreciate beauty in whatever form, and then letting that beauty unlock creativity and innovation inside of you. So it can be natural or it can be man-made. Some people experience it listening to music or watching a theater or a dance recital or going to an art museum. There's multiple ways that we all experience the beauty of the world and then allow it to unlock the creativity inside of us.
Yeah. And again, that can be in the political sense, unlocking the creativity of how do I set up Thanksgiving to make it a good experience? Or what is my next step in responding to this thing that is pulling on my heart in the world?
Absolutely. For a lot of people who are entrepreneurs is the word that comes to mind, but the type of person who is a forerunner, who's the kind of person who's willing to start things, the creative process is paramount. Nobody starts a new mission or movement without creativity being at the forefront of it.
Yeah. So what are some of the consequences of forgoing rest in these different areas?
Well, that's what we're living. That's what we're seeing right now. So the consequences of foregoing rest is a lot of mean, irritated, upset people, because most of us, when we become fatigued, we don't have the capacity to be nice anymore. We don't have the capacity for patience or kindness or any of those types of things. We're too tired to deal with other people. And so that's a big part of it. And then the other side of that is we have a lot of people who are pouring from their emptiness. And so even people who are trying to do good are doing it from a place of being empty. And so they show up and they try to do great work in different areas, but they don't have passion for it. They burn out very quickly. They don't have sustainability. They can't stay in fields for long periods of time. I can't tell you how many people I know who started nonprofits and 5 years later they're out because they're burned out. They tried to do everything themselves. They didn't build teams. Starting something is easier than sustaining it. And so we have to really understand that rest is not just about, oh, I need a vacation. A vacation is not adequate burnout prevention. It's too few and far between. Rest is about small restorative practices we can build into our everyday life so that we are constantly pouring back into places that we're depleting. You're depleting these places every day. You have to have a systematic way of pouring into them. And it shouldn't always require you having to overthink it. Some of the things that, I talk about in my book, Sacred Rest, are things that are habitual. You build it around a habit you're already doing. Some of it is set it and forget it. So once you start, it's in place. And now you already have a restorative practice that's built into your life. We have to realize that if we want to see a different kind of world, we have to be a different kind of people. And it's going to require a change in how we feel. We can't be nice and kind and compassionate if we feel drained and depleted and at the end of ourselves.
Yeah. And just to put a fine point on this for our listeners who are thinking this election matters so much, I'm just going to pour into it and I will rest on November 6th. Is it viable to even just put it off for a short period of time?
Well, you would be more effective if you rested in the process.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about rest and spirituality. In your chapter on spiritual rest, you talk about the valley of the wounded and how rest is a spiritual place where healing can begin. But you're really careful to not paint this place as one that's without pain. In fact, you say there is no healing without pain. Can you talk about how rest sometimes involves looking at the hard stuff?
Oh, it absolutely involved looking at the hard stuff. We have to look at where the deficit is. And specifically when we're looking at the spiritual aspect of it, and in some other areas as well, the deficit is coming from a place of pain. It's a place we've been wounded. And so for I think a lot of us, we try to avoid pain. I mean, our entire culture is built around. That's why we have a narcotic epidemic. We don't like pain. We don't want to hurt. We don't want to feel deeply. However, that's what life is. That's the reality of it. Life has joy and it has pain. And you can't separate them from life. I'm an internal medicine physician, and in my practice, if someone comes in and they have a wound, the way that I can tell whether or not the wound has the ability to heal is if it's still painful. If it's still painful, that means there's still tissue there that's alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so when someone tells me, I don't have any emotions related to politics, I don't have any feelings about this whatsoever, it's like, okay, what died? Where did your emotions around this die? Because there should be some feeling around it. It's not bad to have feelings about things that affect your life. And when you don't have feelings about it, that's not healthy. You should have parts of politics that make you weep, that you're like, oh, I don't like this. You should have parts of politics that you're like excited about. That's the ebb and flow of living.
And how does rest help us enter that space where we're willing to like, oh gosh, this does break my heart and this gives me hope, but my heart is really still broken over here. What does rest, how does it open up space to kind of enter into that?
Well, it causes you to stop and listen to you. It requires you to deal with you.
Mm-hmm.
You can be so busy that you never have to deal with you. And we have a lot of people who they are so busy, they never sit with their own thoughts. They never silence their world so they can hear their inner thoughts. They never allow themselves just to be still in a moment and look without engaging. I think one of the most powerful things someone can do who says, I don't get involved with politics, go sit on the corner bench of any big city and just watch people. Just watch them. Don't try to help them. Don't try to solve anything. Don't speak to them. Just watch. You'll see a child that's laughing and have the time of their life with a parent on their arm who is like, you can tell, beyond stressed out. You'll see the person down the street who has a cup up hoping somebody will just acknowledge that they're there. They're not wanting quarters. They just literally want someone to acknowledge that I'm here, that I'm valuable in some form, even if I can't be productive in this moment. I'm not producing a car or a lecture or anything, but I'm still valuable. I'm still a human. You'll watch the bus zooming by, the cars zooming by, the honking horns, and all these people rushing to wherever they got to go. But when they get there, are they happy? Are they living the life that they always dreamed of? Or are they just existing? When we sit and just evaluate these things and we get real with what we see around us, it then requires us to turn inwardly and ask ourselves the very same questions. Do I feel seen? Am I rushing to things that I value? Or am I rushing to things that are just, I feel like I have to go there?
Yeah. I love that you gave this practice in the context of a question about spirituality, because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, like, what do I mean by spirituality if I'm going to try and have this podcast that's inclusive of a lot of different people's experiences. And we settled on a definition by Brene Brown that talks about leaning into the truth of the fact that we're all interconnected and that we're bound together by something that's bigger than us, and that something's rooted in love. And I think many different religious traditions that resonates with them, but even for people who aren't necessarily religious, this idea of interconnectedness and of a larger reservoir of love, this practice of just watching people is such a beautiful way to enter into it and then come back to also that you are so deeply loved, right? That I love that. I can't wait to try it and to think of it as a way of resting and of coming back to those deeper truths. So your book goes into a lot of things that rest can unlock for us. When you think specifically about politics, what do you think it can unlock for us there?
The book is divided up into a couple of different sections for those who aren't aware. And I do talk quite heavily about my spiritual beliefs in the second half of the book, because that is a huge part for me. As you mentioned, quite a bit of my work is featured in places where they're not really concerned about my spiritual beliefs. They're just wanting defiance of what I shared. Specifically for that reason, the beginning of the book is very science research rich, and then the second half is very spiritual rich. In the second half of the book, I talk about the gifts of rest, and I feel like some of those gifts that pop out include things like boundaries and reflection, like we just mentioned. Communication is another one, and even just the freedom of being who you are. In the resting, we become more comfortable with who we are. We understand ourselves a little bit better. So it's easier for me to communicate to someone my boundaries if I know me better. It's easier for me to see the places where I need restoration when I reflect upon how my life is. Am I living the life of success that I desire, or am I living someone else's definition of what that may look like? Communicating, being able to tell someone what it is that I am needing as it relates to my own sanity and my own ability to have a restored type life. All of those things come when we look at these different areas and get real about what's needed to restore any of them.
Yeah. Can you tell your story about speaking to a large conference of, I think, women physicians and about just the walls coming down? I just found that story really, really impactful. And I think we also build up these walls in the political space. And I think we have to begin to let them go and rest and find what's on the other side of it.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that, because speaking is primarily what I do now within my company, Restore Assist. We work with corporations and organizations to help them get back to a place of well-being as far as understanding how to apply rest and restorative practices within the workplace and within communities. And long before I was ever doing that, I had that invite to go to that particular women's conference, and it was all female physicians. And so we had internists and surgeons and anesthesiologists and pediatricians, you name it. We were all in the room together. And as you know, all of those are completely different personality. We got the really compassionate, and we're like, put them to sleep so I can cut them and move them out of my way. So we have completely different types of doctors in the room with different personalities. And it was my second time speaking at this particular organization, and they specifically said, we are not talking to each other. This was before I had publicized the book, but I was already talking about things like social rest specifically, and the rest that can be experienced around people who understand your journey, like they are in similar fields and walk with you. And they were like, we want to have this opportunity for the women to talk with each other, but they're not talking. Everybody's in their own shell and in their own box and all of these things. And I had this really great talk that I put together, and I'm really looking forward to giving this really great talk. And I stepped up on that stage, and the moment I stepped on that stage and I looked out there, I was like, this talk is not going to do it. These women are like icebergs. The walls are high in this room. And I just got really transparent and vulnerable. Like my talk went out the window. I just spoke from my heart. And as I'm speaking and just sharing with them at a level of authenticity and rawness that I would never have had the boldness and courage to share in front of my peers, no less, I literally watched woman after, people started weeping. It was just a whole experience. And it was so interesting because it started off with me just entering into a moment of sharing authentically. I actually began that particular story with sharing a song. I started singing like a little hymn that came to mind. And then I went into sharing my talk. I never sing in front of people because I don't feel like I have a fantastic voice. But I was like, let me just take every wall down. And let me just be real in this moment. And it's been interesting because occasionally I'll be in different settings. I had a national speaking event at an organization who focuses on vaccines and immunizations. And that's a hot topic in politics. And I remember speaking to them, and I had my slides, and I did stay on point for the most part with the slides. But at one point, I just said, thank you for being in the hard. And I just really had a heart-to-heart moment with them. And men, women, CEOs, CFOs, everything in between came up afterwards and expressed to me what that meant. Just to have someone to acknowledge how hard it's been in that season and the pain and I specifically spoke to. I know some of you have lost friends over this, and I went through the whole thing. This wasn't in my notes. It was just a human moment. I get it. It's hard. Life's hard. Sometimes doing what you feel is right, people don't get your intentions and they call you wrong, and it hurts. Feels like a rejection. It feels like nobody understands you. And so I think it's important to realize that when you see it and to be able to call it out and to say it, because it's important that we don't isolate each other from the human experience. I may not agree with what you agree with politics. I may be going one way, you may be going the other direction. But I can respect you as a person in the process. I don't need to bring you down and think that's going to solve the political situation. I can still hold you high as I express what I believe.
I love that so much. I'm just going to hold on to thank you for being in the hard, because first, there's so many people that are doing hard things in politics and outside of politics, and just acknowledging the difficulty. I think that's part of what rest provides, is that we get to say what I'm doing is hard, and we can rest in that. But then also what you were talking about earlier, that rest enables you to be more in touch with yourself and to drop some of these walls. So this is a small quote in the book, but I just loved it. You said that rest testifies to our humanity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think every one of us knows we need to rest, but we treat ourselves kind of robotically. And even our robotics require rest. My phone, when it gets down to 10%, it's like my computer, the same. It's, hey, you better figure out how to restore me, because I'm just going to be out. And even our non-humane beings do that. But with the humanity of rest is that we have to recognize this for ourselves, and we have to recognize this for other people, because all of us need rest. The political candidates, whether you like them or not, also need rest in their lives. It's a part of the human experience we all walk through, this need for restoration.
And it's, I need rest because I'm not superhuman and I make mistakes and life is hard. And I think reminding us that I need this, but so does every single other person I meet. Life is hard for them too. And just like me, they're not perfect. And we're all in this together. And we all have basic needs, rest being one of them, safety, belonging, all of these things. They're needs that transcend political differences, transcends all differences, because it's just what humans need, right?
And it allows you to give grace to people when you see them in ways that maybe you're thinking, wow, that was really harsh. This is something I do quite often. I look at the political candidates as they're campaigning to get into office. I watch them as they go through office. And oftentimes I'll look to my husband and I say, wow, he looks really tired. And he looks really drained from all of this. Whether I like the person or whether I voted for them or not, I realize that whoever you are that's leading a country, that's a hard thing. You're human. You're not God. You're human. So, you're going to get things right. You're not going to make everybody happy. God himself has not made everybody happy. Nobody can make everybody happy. And just being able to take a step back and to recognize that.
Yeah. Some people, although hopefully not after hearing this conversation, might think of rest as inaction or as giving up, especially in the political realm. But you write that rest is participating in the delicate exchange between faith and action. Can you talk a little bit about how rest enables action?
Yeah, it helps us to be able to see our next step more clearly. When I talk about rest, I'm thinking about restorative practice that fill us back up, get us back up to a better place than where we entered into things. And so when that happens, you're more clear. Your body's not achy. You physically feel stronger and better. You're not going through the anxiety and the agitation of sensory overload. You're allowed to yourself to settle your spirit a little bit. You're more mindful in how you respond and how you move forward. Your innovation and your creativity is higher. And so you filled yourself back up to be at the best level of pouring out that you can be. And I think for a lot of us, that's a place we haven't seen in a while because we haven't been very intentional about how we're resting. We do nothing on the weekend, and we call that rest. And sometimes that's just cessation. Sometimes that's escapism. Sometimes there's nothing restorative about it whatsoever. And so to be aware of whether or not we're actually pouring back into a place of deficit and realizing that when we do, it prepares us for our next action.
So now the opposite of that, which is that sometimes we do need to stop. You have a beautiful list in your chapter on the gift of cessation on when doing nothing is the right answer or could be the right answer. Can you walk us through those in the realm of politics?
In the realm of politics, I would probably say if your response, your activity, your movement in the situation is only to serve you being right, that's probably a good time to stop. I think we have to just take a look at what is it we're fighting for? And is the fight leading to something that's more selfish and that just boosts our own ego? Or is the fight in it for something that is going to actually move the global needle or move the collective needle in a direction?
Yeah. I also think some of the other points where you point to cessation being, or at least a pause, as being good, speak to things like when we're upset or when we're anxious or when we're afraid, right? Like moving when we're in those really charged spaces is sometimes not the best way forward. And so I think there's also just an awareness of like, where am I at? And it gets to your question of why. Like, why am I in this fight? Why do I want to engage? And being able to recognize if that why is coming from depletion or fear.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think anytime we are responding because of fear, guilt, or shame, we're more likely to move in a direction of self-protection, which may or may not be healthy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so can you go back through the 7 types of rest and just talk about a couple small practices that people can begin to incorporate into their day if they feel like they're experiencing a rest deficit in that area, particularly if it's coming from politics, but really if it's coming more broadly, because a lot of times it's hard to parse out the political deficit from the rest of our lives deficit because it's all one jumble. So yeah, just take us through some small practices.
Let's see. So with sensory, some of the things you could consider doing is downgrading your consumption of some of the news, being mindful and aware of how much of that you consume, turning off the notifications on your phone for some of those different things. For creative, looking at what inspires you and bringing it into your atmosphere. So whether that's changing the lock screen on your phones to scenery or a beach scene or something of that nature that inspires you in some way. That could be as simple as being aware that there is benefit in doing things like going to a museum or going for a hike out into the woods and appreciating nature and just being able to factor some of that into your lifestyle. As we're looking at mental rest, one simple tactic that a lot of people use is something called brain dumping. So if you are ruminating over something, maybe you're ruminating over debate, I don't know, whatever it may be that you're ruminating over, a to-do list the next day, any of those kind of things, just having a pad where you're jotting down whatever your thoughts are about it. It's not that the thoughts don't need to be evaluated and looked at. It's just that when you ruminate over it, you're training your brain to hold on to the information, and the process of writing it down on something concrete like a piece of paper or a notepad gives your brain permission to release it, which actually does help at nighttime with getting into deeper levels of sleep and being able to clear your mind out. Doing mindfulness type practices also is helpful for that. So it could be meditation in the traditional form of meditation, or it could be something like doing a jog. A lot of people, when they go jogging or they lift heavy weights or do something that's robotic, rowing and different things like that, chopping wood can do the same thing. But those robotic type activities can cause your brain to go into a meditative state because you're focusing your attention on something very specific. So in the case of jogging, it might be your breathing and your cadence. So you've narrowed the thought process down to a place where it functions as if you're meditating. People who may struggle with traditional meditation, looking at some physical activities that will actually help to get your mind to a quiet place. And I think that's part of it, is recognizing that these 7 types of rest, you can incorporate and get some things together. Like you go for a walk in the park, you've got some creative and you got some physical rest because you're moving your body. You might be physically working hard, like in the case of jogging, but resting in another area, like mentally. So they're not exclusive of each other. They can work together, and sometimes you might be working while resting.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the tools you have available for people who are trying to figure out how to move through this and move into rest in a more intentional way?
Yeah, so you mentioned the book Sacred Rest. That's where it's all put together, I would say, in a package as far as going through all of the 7 and the different gifts of rest. We have a free assessment at restquiz.com. It is a true assessment. It takes about 5 or more minutes, depending on how quick or fast you read. But what it does is at the end of it, it gives you a score in all of the 7 types of rest. So you're able to determine which area you have the greatest deficit in and begin to take steps in the direction of restoring that area of rest. Because you can't eat the elephant. You can't fix all 7 at one time if you're depleted in all 7. Pick one. Do some of the different strategies, find the strategies that work best for you, and then move from there to any other areas of deficits you may have. We also have a 30-day Resting Well video program that a lot of people like to walk through and go through the 30-day Sacred Rest Challenge to be able to learn how to begin to implement this in just small changes throughout their day.
One of the things you talk about in the book, but then also in your appearances, is this idea that there's lots of tools for all 7 types in terms of restoring them. And part of this is experimentation, right? Just trying things and seeing if it works and leaning into the things that work. How do you know if a given tactic is working?
You feel better. That fatigue, that feeling of I'm tired, you start feeling better, and you can tell that your energy has improved, because that's what rest is about, all about restoration of energy. It's an energy management strategy, and so you start feeling more energized. The number one question people ask me, knowing all the different stuff I do, from running a company to being a physician to writing books to doing research, are like, how do you do it all? And it's like, nobody does it all. You have so much energy, you determine where you're going to expend energy, and when the energy gets low, you do things to get the energy back up. And so I feel like often people say that because their energy is so low, they're like, I don't have energy to do anything else, or even to maybe do the things that you know you have to do. So when we pour back into the energy that you need to live the type of life that you want, it doesn't feel taxing anymore because your energy is being restored on a regular basis.
Yeah. So as I was thinking about this project, and I knew I really wanted rest to be one of the things to offer our listeners and to have our listeners enter into. In my religious tradition, that's Sabbath, because it's not just rest, it's sacred rest. Your book is it's not just the science of all of this. Can you talk about Sabbath as a practice and why that's important?
When I think about Sabbath, and there's quite a few religious belief systems that have adopted a Sabbath type practice. But when I think about Sabbath and the way it's looked at from a Jewish tradition, Sabbath wasn't simply about sitting around doing nothing. Sabbath was a pouring into that started the week. And it's from that being poured into that people went out and did the rest of their work. The way I look at rest is that it should be sacred and treated as such. It's the way I get filled up to do the work that I was created and designed to do. And so that includes everything from time with family, which is a huge part of Sabbath, blessings being spoken over people, connecting with people, making sure they understand that they are loved, that they belong, that they are accepted, that their life has meaning and purpose and value. So pouring into the humanity part of a person, pouring into the part of you that requires good nourishment. So there's foods and feasts and all types of things. And so there's kind of a whole part of that then speaks to, I have a physical body that also has to be nurtured as well. There's a cessation component to it where you don't do a lot of heavy lifting or work, and you don't do a lot of physical stuff that's going to physically drain your body. And so that's a big part of it. And then there's also this component of it where there is a kind of forward thinking into what is desired for the week to come. Some people call it the blessing that is placed out there, usually father to family, but the blessing that's placed out there, which is basically a speaking forward into, this is what we want to come from this time that we've spent in Sabbath. And I feel like that's something a lot of us don't do. And I feel like that's actually why I probably wrote this book. As I mentioned, I burned out is how the book even came to pass. I had no intention of writing on this topic. I burned out and I started sharing this information with my patients, and they started sharing it with everybody they knew. And I'm like, okay, this is blown up into its own thing. And I don't have a book about it. I have books about other things. And so I started sharing about it, and it really just took a life of its own. And one of the things that I found for myself was, and the reason that I titled the book Sacred Rest, is I had spent most of my life building a life that I thought I wanted. I want to be a physician. I want to be a mom. I want to do this. I want to do that. Highly driven, highly A-type personality. And I feel most people in politics have a very similar, very A-type personality. I was so focused on building a certain level of success that it never dawned on me to think about what it would feel like to be successful. So I had the makings of success without a feeling of being successful. And I had to realize that there's a feeling of success that I wanted, not the makings, not the outer stuff, but an actual feeling. And that feeling was a feeling of freedom. Freedom to be who I am, freedom to show up in the world with whatever gifts I feel like I've been given, and freedom to do so without having to explain myself all the time to other people because I am comfortable and confident in who I am. That was what I wanted. And I didn't have that at the moment. I had all the outer makings of success. And so I think when we start really getting to the core, especially as it relates to politics, I think each of us has to take a look at our own lives and determine what is the type of life that we want to not only have it look like, but feel as it relates to politics and how we relate to other people regarding politics.
I love a couple different pieces of that. So one, this idea of Sabbath of rest is including this component of looking forward, of this like imagining and intention setting that I think is so important as we enter politics, to not just be in the chaos of what is right now, but of what could be. I very rarely think about rest as being forward-looking. So I love that you brought that in because I think that's really important. And then just what you ended on with freedom, right? Especially how you defined freedom of being able to enter your life as you. I think that if we could enter politics as ourselves without all of these trappings, I think it could really change things. So thank you for your reflections on rest and for being brave and entering into a conversation about politics, which is not always easy. I'm so appreciative. I end all of my podcast interviews with the same question. The podcast goal is to enable people to engage politically with hope. And so I'm curious as to how you're engaging this election season and what is giving you hope.
Yeah, a couple of elections ago, a friend and I wrote a book called Colorful Connections, 12 Questions that Open Up Healthy Conversations Around Race. And that has been something that I found has been really helpful in engaging with people, just in hard conversations around politics as well, because it was during a political season that we wrote that particular book, because race was a big part of what was dividing politics and just how people converse around it. And so a lot of what I'm doing is really just leading conversations. One of the things we talk about in the book is I hold offense very loosely. It's hard to offend me because I have grace for you to not like me. It's okay. You know what I mean? And so I think it's important for us to practice that, to practice being very open with letting people experience us however they experience us, and not having to feel like I have to hold on to your offense.
Yeah, I love that. I can't wait to go find that book. And then I'll also hold on to this idea of holding offense lightly and just having grace as we move through all this. Because I think having conversations, it's one of the hardest things we can do, but it is also one of the most hopeful things we can do too. And it's something that our current politics makes hard. But if we're brave enough to try it and give ourselves and each other grace, I think it can begin to change things. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and for all that you are doing in the world to promote rest, but to promote living our full lives.
Thank you.
At This Election, we see politics as practice, and each conversation is paired with a practice that you can take with you as you heal from and engage the political arena. Dr. Saundra invites you into restorative practices for the rest deficit that is most acute in your life. You can discover this through her free rest quiz at www.restquiz.com. You can then explore practices for restoration in that specific area through her book, Sacred Rest, through her free Sacred Rest Challenge, which provides a daily email with inspiration for incorporating rest into your day, and through her online course, Resting Well. I'm also including a link to Wayne Muller's book, Sabbath. Drawing on multiple spiritual traditions, each chapter provides a different practice that you can bring into your daily life. I read this book around the same time as I read Sacred Rest, and I found the combination really impactful. Links to these resources can be found in the show notes and on our website at www.thiselection.org/spiritual-practices. That page includes offerings from all of our guests, including a link from the class, which is a practice we explore in episode 3 with JC Gossett. That link gives our listeners a free 30-day subscription to their digital studio. You have been listening to This Election, where we explore the inner work that is needed to do politics differently. Today we heard from Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith. You can connect with her on her website at www.drdaltonsmith.com and on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Threads at Dr. Dalton Smith. I'm your host, Katie Cochran, and I would love to hear from you. You can find me on Instagram at katie.m.cochran, or you can email me at katie@thiselection.org. Now I have a favor to ask. If you have enjoyed this conversation, would you mind rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever platform you're listening through? This is the best way to help our vision of a different type of politics reach as many people as possible. A note of thanks to the wonderful people who helped me with this episode. The theme music was written and performed by Ian Cochran, with production help by David Cochran. The watercolor painting that you see on the podcast artwork was created by Kristen Connolly and is available for purchase via her website at love.kristen.com. Finally, a note of thanks to you. Doing politics differently is not easy, and I'm so grateful for the steps that you're taking to heal our politics. Thank you for being on this journey with me.